General Clapper, our Director of National Intelligence, I think it was at the very end of January or maybe very early February, testified about the Hezbollah and their growing influence and involvement in the Western Hemisphere. And part of his testimony, at least in part, related to are they willing to strike us at home? Is Iran willing to hit us where it's going to hurt us most, right here at home? And the general mentioned in his comments and his testimony that there was growing concern by our intel community that in fact could happen. One key example, in fact it was his principal example that he used to kind of support that feeling, was that plot a few months earlier that was thankfully foiled by the FBI and the DEA to assassinate a Quds Force plot to assassinate the Saudi Arabian ambassador right here in the United States, in Washington, D.C. most likely, with a car bomb, for God's sakes. Okay, now think about that. Pretty shocking revelation. Why did General Clapper really climb out on a limb and use that particular example? I'll tell you why, folks. Because it has been assessed from every angle it can be assessed from by every three-letter agency in our nation's security apparatus, and it's been proven to be credible. It's not just intel, folks. It's information that was captured on judicially approved wiretaps and other evidence from confidential sources and others that can pass the judicial test in a federal courthouse anywhere in the United States. This was not information that was gleaned from one or two informants and then cobbled together and put out as some kind of a product. It was a federal investigative agency or agencies initiative that led to this. This is another important point. So the question is, I think, based on that revelation, or that use of the general's use of that example, is does Hezbollah or does Iran have the ability to strike us here at the homeland? I happen to believe that they do. So the follow-on questions are, well, how would they do it? I think it makes logical sense, and I don't think I'll get any pushback whatsoever from the other two gentlemen at this table, hopefully from few of you, that they do have the ability to hit us right here in the homeland, and that Iran would naturally use Hezbollah and potentially the Quds to do just that. So how is that possible? As I continue to kind of walk you through this situation logically from the 30,000 foot, how is that possible? I'll tell you how it's possible, folks. The Hezbollah and the Quds Force have become involved in the global cocaine trade in a very, very large way. They got their start just a few short years ago down in the tri-border area, acquiring relatively small amounts of cocaine, 15 to 20 kilogram quantities, moving it across the Atlantic and into other locations in Europe, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and elsewhere, where their $75,000 to $100,000 investment turns into $1 million in profit almost overnight. Flash forward, in just 6 or 7 short years, the Hezbollah is now moving tons of cocaine into West Africa, onward into North Africa, and eventually into Europe through the soft underbelly of Spain. And who do the investigative agencies and intelligence agencies most typically bump into? Other nefarious actors and characters, as they're focused on the Hezbollah. Should be no surprise to anyone whatsoever that it's the Quds Force. When you find one, where you find one, you will naturally find the other. So their involvement in this activity has brought them much closer to our neighborhood. It's brought them much, much closer to our doorstep. If anyone in their right mind believes for a moment that the Hezbollah and Quds Force have not realized and recognized the strategic value that forging relationships with the Mexican and Colombian cartels bring to them, then they're either ignorant or they're naive. I don't care what agency or organization that they come from. People are not asking these kinds of tough questions. You know, why would they associate themselves with groups like this? Well, one thing for sure is they're now involved in the global cocaine trade, and they've been involved in the other drugs trade over the years, heroin and marijuana and other drugs coming out of other parts of the world. So why would they team with these folks? Because they are masters, and they have been for decades, at identifying existing smuggling and organized crime infrastructures that have been developed for decades, and leveraging them and exploiting them for everything they're worth. They're doing it in West Africa. They're doing just that with the Kurds and other in North Africa. They're doing it throughout Europe and elsewhere. I'm told that DEA agents, investigators, the extraterritorial teams are routinely running into both of these very powerful threats in places as austere as the Macron Coast, North Africa, West Africa, the tri-border of Latin America. All right? So it poses a significant threat, this growing confluence, this growing connection between the two. Mike Chertoff, about 4 years ago, just as he was leaving as the Secretary of Homeland Security, testified before Congress. And he told Congress, he said, look, we need to stay focused on Al-Qaeda. There's no doubt about it. But the real threat is Hezbollah. The Hezbollah and the Kurds possess a capacity that Al-Qaeda could only dream that they had. And that capacity and that ability is tied directly to their global contacts and global relationships that they have built with organized crime and other terrorist organizations around the globe. So if we think for one moment that as more and more of these very dangerous types of folks pour into the Western Hemisphere, if we think that they would not do the same thing on our borders, if we think that they would not do the same thing throughout Latin America, then again, I mean, it's just absolute nonsense. We need to be asking ourselves another question, I believe, based on based on what I've just said. And it really comes down to this. The Quds Force controls, most experts believe, the Quds Force controls the strategic missile program in Iran to this day. And if that's the case, who's going to be holding the keys to Iran's future nuclear weapons arsenal? I think the answer is, again, based on logic, is pretty simple. I think it's going to be Quds. And the Quds are now, as far as I'm concerned, far too close to our nation than they need to be. And I'm talking about geographically, obviously. So what are three things that we can do? Let me sum this up real quick. What are three things that I think that we could be doing that we're not doing, that we should be doing, to focus on this threat that's looming very close to the homeland? One thing we need to be doing is we need to be developing interlocking counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism strategies. And we need to be, there need to be singular funding streams tied to those strategies. As the picture I just pointed pretty clearly demonstrates, over half of the designated terrorist organizations, or organizations that have been formally designated by the Department of State, are now involved in one or more aspects of the global drug trade. As drugs and terrorists come together, or drug traffickers and terrorists come together, ladies and gentlemen, in our country, our government agencies that are responsible for counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism are drifting further apart. They are. There are no interlocking strategies, and there are multiple funding streams, and all of you have been in this town long enough to know what happens when you're faced with with that scenario, okay? We're driving a wedge right between our own security forces, as far as I'm concerned. We need to be doing more to focus on a defense in depth, rather than continuing this focus on defending the 1 yard line, meaning our southwest border. Right after 9/11, over 60% of the Department of Defense's D&M assets were moved to other parts of the world. And as some folks in this room can tell you, they occasionally drift back, but there has been not a sustained presence of those assets in the Western Hemisphere that we once had. And that hurts us. We don't have the resources in our own neighborhood that we once had. And it's going to bite us in the butt. Part of that, an important piece of that, developing a defense in depth, is we've got to pay closer attention to permissive environments that allow very powerful drug trafficking cartels and terrorist organizations to thrive in, that are now operating in the same space at the same time, vying for the same contraband revenue, most often generated from drug trafficking. These groups are coming together, and we're not doing a great deal, quite honestly, to drive a wedge between them and get them separated from one another and apart from one another. We've got to be doing more of that. We're not. I'm talking about places like, as an example, Guinea-Bissau in West Africa. I'm talking about the Sahel and Sahara areas. I'm talking about Northeast Africa. I'm talking about the tri-border area of Latin America. I'm talking about Venezuela. I'm talking about a lot of permissive environments around the world that allow these groups to come very closely together, and the products that result from that kind of a confluence, that coming together by the potpourri of global scum is shocking, okay? We need to be breaking them up. And the last thing that I would say, the third thing that I believe we need to be doing, that we're not doing, is we need to refocus, quite frankly, on the traditional threats. I'm not saying take our eye off of terrorism and focusing aggressively on terrorist organizations and terrorist threats. But folks, our nation's law enforcement, especially at the federal level, needs to be going head on with the traditional threats. Those being drugs, human and arms trafficking, as well as money laundering. And we're not. Let me remind you that it was the DEA handlers and their informant focused on a traditional threat, drugs and drug-related money laundering, that brought that informant, thankfully, into contact with that Kurds operative that tried to recruit him to assassinate the Saudi ambassador here in the United States. The last thing I will say is this: the money laundering piece of focusing on the traditional threats. We cannot forget, well, first of all, we need to do more with respect to counter-threat finance and money laundering. We do. There's no doubt about it. But at the same time, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot forget about the currency of contraband. Drugs, guns, counterfeit documents, I could go on and on, are routinely traded for weapons. They are routinely sold for revenues by terrorist organizations and insurgent organizations around the globe that not only keep their movements alive, but help to grow them. But we have forgotten about the contraband of revenue, or excuse me, the currency of contraband. We're not focused on seizing and disrupting those organizations responsible for trafficking in drugs and many other traditional organized crime types of contraband, as focused as we should be. Thanks very much. Again, appreciate, Matt, the opportunity to be here, and I'll be happy to answer your questions a little bit later.